Pam Bondi just got exposed in the ugliest way possible, caught covering up Jeffrey Epstein's $1.1 billion dirty transfers. This isn't rumor, this is hard evidence of power, money, and betrayal at the highest levels. The victims were silenced, the truth was buried, and Bondi chose to stand with secrecy instead of justice.
He was a serial rapist of women and young girls. And for some reason, the Trump administration, that claimed they'd be the most transparent administration ever, turned on a dime. The president had run on a campaign with a promise to expose the Epstein files. Now he and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, say, nope, nothing to investigate. When it comes to Epstein and sex trafficking, all these claims are just ludicrous. I want the American people to know that that's wrong. If you want to know why, just look at the latest report from our investigators that was discussed in the New York Times this morning. Now, somewhere in the Treasury Department, Mr. President, locked away in a cabinet drawer, is a big Epstein file that's full of actionable information. Follow the money details about his financing and operations that await investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency, based on the response, didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking. But I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand the President's handling of this or why he thinks this is just going to go away. But I'm here to say that our investigators have spent 3 full years looking into this. And the reason why is because we feel so strongly about the horror of sex trafficking and our commitment to root it out.
Senator Ron Wyden stood on the Senate floor and dropped a revelation so heavy that Washington went silent. He exposed what's been buried in the Treasury Department for years, a hidden file tied directly to Jeffrey Epstein. Real government documents showing more than $1.1 billion moving in and out of Epstein's accounts. This wasn't gossip from tabloids. This was the U.S. Treasury confirming that Epstein's finances looked less like the spending habits of one man and more like the financial footprint of a global criminal enterprise. And here's the part that makes it even worse. This file wasn't lost, it wasn't forgotten, it was locked away. For years, every attempt to bring it to light was quietly blocked. Officials acted like it didn't exist, while behind the scenes, investigators saw exactly what was in those pages. Thousands of wire transfers, billions of dollars, and a trail that could have blown open one of the darkest scandals in modern history. Wyden didn't bring speculation, he brought hard numbers. 4,725 wire transfers. Just let that sit for a second. 4,725 separate transactions tied to Epstein. And that's from only one of his accounts. Altogether, nearly $1.1 billion was flowing through. And that's just the beginning. Hundreds of millions more were tied to his other accounts. This wasn't a billionaire buying yachts and mansions. This was structured movement of money. Thousands of leads. Thousands of chances for investigators to pull the thread and expose a network. Yet nothing was done. Those transfers were ignored, filed away like they didn't matter. And here's what makes it undeniable. Those transactions weren't random. They had patterns. They had destinations. And some of those destinations should have set off alarms the size of sirens, because Epstein wasn't just moving money through American banks. The Treasury file shows he was pushing money through multiple Russian banks. Not just any banks, banks that are now sanctioned for corruption and secrecy, banks tied to hostile networks. Ask yourself why Epstein, already exposed as a predator, was funneling money through the very institutions known for laundering dirty cash. And when you connect the financial trail to the human trail, the picture becomes even darker. So many of Epstein's victims came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and other countries caught up in these same trafficking routes. The overlap is undeniable. The money moved through those banks, and the girls came from those same regions. And standing right at that door was someone who knew exactly what was at stake: Pam Bondi. As Florida's Attorney General, she had direct knowledge of Epstein's crimes in the very state where some of his worst abuses happened. Later, when she had the power to push for accountability at the national level, she had the authority to demand that file be opened, but she didn't. She stood silent. That's not just a failure of leadership, that's betrayal. Betrayal of the victims whose lives were shattered. Washington wants us to believe this is just too complicated, too murky, too messy to investigate. But Wyden's words cut through the noise. It's not a theory, it's not a hoax. It's math. It's $1.1 billion in cold, hard numbers. It's thousands of transfers, Russian banks, trafficking routes, and victims who never got justice. And Pam Bondi, instead of opening the door to that truth, chose to close it.